Good morning, Reverend Sharon Buttry. I live in Hamtramck. I've been a longtime Michigan United volunteer. I'm now with the Faith and Justice Group and the Criminal Justice Reform Group. I'm co-leader of the Detroit Hamtramck Coalition for Advancing Healthy Environments. My two passions are criminal justice reform because of family members who've been incarcerated, and also environmental racism because it impacts my community. Great to see all of you. You're my family.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Wesleyan Mayor Bill Wild, and Pastor Leslie Matthews asked me to join today if I had a few minutes, so I'm looking forward to spending some time with you this morning. Thank you.
All right, are we, I think we're missing one of our panelists who didn't introduce himself yet. Is Mr. Parker here? William Parker?
Go ahead, Mr. Parker.
All right, can you say it again
Hello?
and make sure we got your audio? We hear you, William. Can you speak again just to make sure it's clear?
William Parker.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Kate.
I know we probably didn't get everybody, but I do want to maybe get into the panel discussion since we're getting participants still trickling in. So yeah, thank you guys for being here today. We are going to talk about reshaping public safety. I hope everybody can see Bishop Stark's screen share here. And Bishop, I don't know if you're able to make it full screen on mine. It's a little bit small, but we've got our four panelists.
Okay, let me try to adjust.
Thank you. And before we get into that, I'm going to toss it to Dr. Duckworth to give us a little bit of an introduction to the Criminal Justice Department at Michigan United and the work that you guys are doing. So Dr. Duckworth, if you want to start us off.
Thank you, Kate. Wanted to just welcome everyone to this workshop, very important workshop. And I'll just add that policing in America began as slave catchers. Then it moved to making sure people of color stayed in their place by the code words law and order. But I want to say, if you feel like I feel, it's been over 400 years, it is time for an overhaul, a major overhaul. The experience last summer of George Floyd was not something that was brand new, as even the thug who took his life was relaxed with his hands in his pocket, which showed me that he was comfortable doing this, and this was not his first rodeo. But it's time now to discuss reshaping our public safety so that all Americans can feel safe in their community, especially from those who we pay to protect and serve everyone. And so we have a wonderful panel of a group of panelists here. They've already introduced themselves, but I'll say it again. We are thankful to Dr. Lisa Jackson, to Esquire Robert Burton Harris, Mr. William Parker, and Pastor Velma Jean Overman. And again, welcome to our workshop.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Duckworth. And I hope everybody can see, looks like we got our technical difficulties sorted out. So thank you, Bishop. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to go ahead and I introduce myself. I told you all I was the grants manager here at Michigan United. And that means that a big part of my job is making sure that our organizers like Dr. Duckworth get the money that they need to do the awesome work that they're doing. And but some of you guys who know me know that before I came to Michigan United, I was public defender. So the work of our criminal justice team is really close to my heart. And I want to start us off by just asking each of the four panelists to just take a minute to kind of frame up this discussion for us. I'm going to ask you guys, how should we define public safety? We often think about it in terms of policing, but I want us to kind of think a little bit beyond just policing. What are the most important things to you that keep our communities safe? What are the things that make communities unsafe? So I'm gonna put Robert Burton Harris on the spot here as a current public defender. And I'm gonna go ahead and toss it to you if you wanna just take a minute to think to kind of define public safety and then pass it along to one of our other fellow panelists.
Thank you. So I've been thinking about this question for a little while, about what exactly do we mean by public safety outside of the obvious kind of policing, as you alluded to, Kate. And for me, it really boils down to more so how we feel when we go about our day, our perception of safety. And so that means that it's not necessarily the statistics and the arrest reports and the number of arrests and the statistics. I mean, that's good and all to have. We need to track and know what our police are doing, but it really boils down to just how we view our sense of safety and what we can expect when we go about our day and we live our lives. So if a person, even if you're in a general area where we consider safe, if a person doesn't feel safe leaving their house, it really doesn't matter what kind of statistics and information you can give them because they don't feel that way. So for me, I think certainly since last summer, the perception and the idea of a person's personal idea of safety, I think, is what defines and drives what we mean by, when we use the term public safety. It's not necessarily what is actually occurring. It's more so what we think is occurring and how we feel when we leave our house. So.
Thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna toss it to Dr. Jackson.
So I certainly agree with everything that Robert said. I'd like to add, though, that so as a psychologist, I certainly think about how people feel, right? And but I think public safety, two things that come to mind. One, it needs to fit the community. So I grew up in Detroit. I now live in Ann Arbor. Public safety might mean different things in those places, or it might not, but it needs to be shaped by the communities that are paying law enforcement and others to work on public safety. So it needs to be specific to a community. And I think public safety should also include some discussion of assistance, right? I mean, it's not just being free from crime, but it's also being able to do the things that we need to do every day. So, I think about these in terms of law enforcement situations that have gone bad. But if you've got a kid who's missed the bus and needs directions on how to get to school without being able to use the bus, that kid needs to be able to ask somebody how to do that. And the kid needs to be able to do that safely. The kid needs to be able to do that and get accurate information and get where he or she or they need to go, right? If you have, a flat tire, you need assistance with that. You don't necessarily need, a law enforcement strategy that cites you for not having correct brake lights at the time, right? So I think public safety has to do with how we feel, but it should also include an idea about the people that we pay through taxpayer dollars, obviously, to serve in our community, to provide some level of assistance as well.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to pass it along to Pastor Overman.
Good morning, everyone. So when I actually think about it, I have to agree with our panelists about public safety, but I want to add this one lens where public safety is so much broader that not only is it because we're doing the reimagining of law enforcement, but I want safe water. I want lit streets. I want the absence of blight. I want a system in place that I don't have to become what we want to include as violent, poverty, and thuggish because I don't have access to what I need. So what does reimagining all of this look like? I think the first thing we have to do is incorporate residents, right? The people that it's going to matter to, like Robert said, when I walk out of my door, or more importantly, being the mother of 3 adult Black men, do I have to worry about a traffic stop? the grandmother to Black young men in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, a predominantly Caucasian place. What does that mean for their lives? So the absence of strategies, as we heard earlier with the Michigan United information, where there are systems in place to ensure that I stay positioned where I am for someone else's benefit. Public safety, how do we address all of that? Can it be reimagined? And my answer is yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that. When we started this planning for this workshop, we really talked a lot about words like reimagining and reshaping public safety and what that really looks like. So thank you. And last but certainly not least, I'm going to pass it to Mr. William Parker.
Good afternoon. I concur with all the panelists on some of the things they have brought forth for law enforcement, but for me, with public safety, it needs to be proactive and progressive. Proactive in the policies that are basically made and progressive in approach when you're making those policies and looking at everybody that's incorporated as times change. So that means it needs to be also inclusive, engaging. Then I think it needs to be educational. There should be some type of platform where law enforcement officers, like they used to in the communities, will go out to the school districts, not only the school districts, go out to the senior citizens, homes, the centers, the ones that's still around, and engage in educational dialogue with the community, the do's and don'ts, and kind of teach the law and some aspects of what your rights is as a person and what law enforcement rights is as a person, as law enforcement officers. I think if you incorporate all that, I think some of the issues we have, I think we can curtail some of those issues. But a lot of times law enforcement officers like to look at themselves as the judge and jury. And a lot of times I don't believe they're as knowledgeable as they believe they are. So I think if we can get those type of things in place, I think that we can reshape law enforcement.
Thank you. It's really eye-opening to hear all four of you guys with different backgrounds, but all related to public safety have so many of the things that you guys are talking about you seem to share. So that I think is encouraging for our agenda going forward. Thank you guys. Our next question, I'm going to throw it to one of our amazing criminal justice organizers, Bishop Herman Starks.
All right. Greetings to each and every one of you. Thank you all for being here. The question I have for Attorney Harris, does cash bail have any connection to public safety? What impact would the elimination of cash bail have on community safety, if any?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I must say, because I'm a lawyer, the views expressed are all my own. They don't represent any organization I work for or with. And also lawyers, we talk too much. So if I'm exceeding my time or if I start breaking up, just let me know. Okay. So the question is about cash bail. So to answer it directly, no, there's no correlation between a person's propensity for violence or their willingness to come to court, which are the two primary reasons for bail. Bail is not supposed to be a punitive thing because if for no other reason, the person hasn't been tried and or convicted yet. So you are dealing with an innocent person. So the propensity for violence or a person's willingness to come to court have no bearing on the amount of money they have in their bank account. In fact, the bail system, any bail system relying too much on cash determination, it makes us actually less safe. And you can see that in jurisdictions that have actually gotten rid of cash bail or modified their cash bail system in some kind of way. You have New Jersey, who recently enacted a slew of bail reforms. This had the effect of actually increasing the number of summons that were issued by police officers. And so this is not, as opposed to making an arrest on the scene, you give a person a summons and by and large, they come back to court. Washtenaw County in Michigan, they have actually gotten rid of all cash bail, meaning that there are other considerations on whether they recommend somebody be kept in jail before their trial, but the money or the person's ability to pay some type of monetary amount is just not a factor. And so, more importantly, though, I think, and even just not even looking at one specific jurisdiction, but because of COVID, all jurisdictions across the country have been impacted and have kind of switched gears into a decarceration mindset. So you have all these jails and jurisdictions that may not even been inclined to do that, all pushing to reduce the number of people in jails because of the public health crisis. And just as a kind of intuitive thing, you just can't keep people in jail forever. They need to get out. They need to be able to provide for their families if it's safe to do so. And so what kind of impact does this have on public safety? Well, 85% of people return to court if they're released on bail. The overwhelming majority do not violate bond conditions or commit new crimes while they're out. So this being released before your trial, it allows a person to continue to work. It allows a person to continue to care for their family and their children. I mean, the second strongest predictor of crime in any jurisdiction is a lack of resources. So if you have a person who is been accused of a crime, they've been arrested, they've been given a bail amount that's too high from the post, they lose their job. And so they eventually do get out. And this is all before the trial. How is that beneficial to the community now that this person has lost their job and they are presumed innocent? What happens if the case is dismissed? So now you've had an innocent person in jail for longer than they needed to be. They've lost their job and now they're even worse off than they were going in, and the community is worse off because of it. So this policy just simply, the policy of pretrial release and not considering cash bail just seems fair to me. I mean, if you have innocent people and they are innocent until proven guilty, what sense does it make to keep them in jail unnecessarily? And I think the last thing I want to say is that, this idea of not jailing people after they've been charged is counterintuitive, but it's only counterintuitive, for members of a nation who seem to think incarceration is the answer. And disassociating bail from money, I think from a psychological standpoint, detaching the money from the analysis of whether a person should be in jail or not, this simply allows us to shift our thinking and helps us stop associating poverty with danger, because there's just no correlation between if a person is able to post bond and the community being safe.
Right. I appreciate that. Thank you for explaining that and being thorough. Without further ado, I want to switch over and send this over to my co-host over here, which is Dr. Duckworth. Thank you.
Again, thank you to our panelists. I can leave this open to whomever would like to answer this question. What are some differences in the way that Black parents teach their children about interacting with the police, as we affectionately call it, the talk, as opposed to what white parents teach their children? And what does that say about the role of implicit bias and racism playing in policing?
I think all of us are parents on this board, I think, on this panel. And certainly I had to talk with both my children, one son and one daughter. I had that talk with them living in Ann Arbor that is considered relatively safe, but I understand they're no safer from the police here than they are if I had moved back to Detroit. I want to tap into your question about implicit bias a little bit and tell a really fast story about something that happened in Ann Arbor. There was like a block party event, and the block party organizers had invited the fire department and the police department to come and hang out. And the police department was interacting with some kids, and they were doing fun activities with them. And at some point in this community, there was a pretty upper middle class community, primarily white, but some Black families there. The police officers thought it would be really fun to handcuff the kids and show them how the handcuffs worked. Meanwhile, so as the white kids lined up to get handcuffed and, we're going to find out about the handcuffs, the Black parents were holding their kids back. And as we all know why. And And the police officers were kind of, confused, and they didn't understand why the Black parents didn't want to participate. And there was a later discussion of how, for us, understanding that no matter how educated we are, no matter where we live, no matter what we do, no matter what we drive, no matter where we walk, the possibility of having our kids being handcuffed is not theoretical, right? We understand it's a very real possibility. We understand that the color of our skin is going to increase the likelihood of that happening, and that is, it's not fun. It's not a joke. It's not, and the police department was completely unaware of the perception of that, right? It's a fun activity. And so part of what implicit bias does is, and the implicit means we're not thinking about it, we're unaware of it, right? And I think we can be made aware of our implicit biases. And I think that is part of what we must do is so people can become aware. And then if they make those choices, they're doing so consciously. But public safety has to include a discussion of that. And the people that we're paying in terms of public safety, police and others have to become aware of how looking at things from only their point of view is inappropriate unless you are serving a community that's 100% homogenous like you, and that doesn't happen in the US. And so implicit bias permeates many things, large and small. Certainly it impacts the way that they see us, that they overestimate how old our children are. When they see a 10-year-old, they think he's 16 and thus treat him accordingly. That many groups of people treat us differently as soon as they see us. They become more afraid than they would have otherwise. And so we have to think about all those things, but we also have to think about the ways they creep into policy and the ways they creep into behavior. And so, police can be as biased as they want, but they need to behave in such a manner that they are treating everybody with dignity and respect. And those are the kinds of things that I think about in the work that I do in Ann Arbor. And it is something that we have a long way to go in Ann Arbor to work on,
All right. If that being it, then I'm going to pass the questioning back to my Kate.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Jackson. I want to ask you guys about we've been talking a lot about policing so far today, and I want to ask about sort of the other side of law enforcement, which is the prosecutor and criminal prosecutions. And so I imagine Robert Burton-Harris might have some things to say about this, but I want to open it up to whoever wants to speak to it. But I want to ask, what role do you all think that criminal prosecutions play in public safety, and what do you think should change, if anything, about sort of what we prioritize, how we prosecute crimes, and what that looks like?
Pastor Jean, a couple of things there. I think about some of the cases that we've seen in the paper, and thankfully we get to see a lot more because of Facebook and everything, where you see a Black woman shoot at a wall, get 15 years in an abusive situation, and someone's murdered by a Caucasian and they get probation. You see huge disparities where I'm trying to get my child in a good school and I get to go to jail, and another person gets to do something totally different. And we're also very aware of some of the things that have happened as a part of systems where I believe it was on the East Coast that the judge, the person in charge of the youth home, and the law enforcement had a system in place where they were just cycling young men straight through to be a part of a workforce that he had, right? So to see these huge disparities that people are in place to make sure that these things continue to happen, so that, and I think someone was speaking about it earlier, how someone had tried to privatize everything. And we've seen that in the penal system where Doritos, a phone call, right? Clothing, all of this was making someone outside very wealthy while we were making sure that we kept the jails full. And those things I think we need to be a part of. And I'm going to speak later on the community and our investment and how we can be a part of change. But I think if we're not aware of things happening and we're in the everyday work of what we do, and we can hear, oh, that's so unfair that this happened. She's getting 15 years for trying to stop somebody and she gave them a warning by shooting, but someone else murdered someone and they don't even go to jail. And we say it and we blow it off and it happens again and again. And we're doing some things with the NAACP where if you are part of this action and it goes for 2 weeks with the protests, after that, everybody forgets, right? You forget as soon as it blows over 14-day period. So we've got to be intentional about this change. I'm trying to think of your name. You just spoke, Alisa. What you were talking about, all I could think about is the police, some of them knew that Black people wouldn't put their hands in a handcuff. Some of them understood what was going on. And it still was something that they were able to intimidate Black parents with their children, right? They know when they pull up on the car and the children are in the back seat and they talk to the dad, take away his manhood. They're aware of that. So an implicit bias is one thing, and an intentional prejudice to demean me is a system that has worked for hundreds of years, and it simply must stop. And I believe it's finally met its match with Facebook and social media and this generation where we've had enough and it's over. So when I think about these systems and the way they make things happen and how it's been a good old boys club and how the average mean for white America is 170,000 and for Black families is 17,000 in 2021, it's met its match and it's time to stop. And of course, preachers are just like lawyers. We could talk forever, so I'm going to stop.
Thank you.
So,
Mr.
yes, yeah, thank you for that. So I'll take a crack at it next. So the question I believe was, what role do prosecutors play in protecting or undermining public safety? Well, prosecutors in the traditional sense, they are the gatekeepers. They are the people, who do the work after police make the arrest. So because they're the gatekeepers and because they have this great responsibility, obviously they can, keep people in the system who everyone agrees should be. But also, of course, prosecutors can undermine public safety by some of the more tough on crime approaches. And, for instance, what's more undermining to public safety than convicting an innocent person? I mean, it's an injustice to the accused. It's also an injustice to the public at large because the real perpetrator may, of course, still be out there. Another thing that I think that prosecutors sometimes have a tendency to do, which is 100% do whatever the victim of a crime wants them to do. And that's just not a prosecutor's mandate. A prosecutor's mandate is to do justice. It's not necessarily to be as vengeful or vindictive as possible because a person who's been victimized by a crime feels that way. It's not about the quantity of convictions, it's about the quality, I think, of the prosecution. So allowing a victim of crime to dictate what ultimately happens in any type of criminal case is just antithetical to what a prosecutor should be doing. Now, as far as reforms, I mean, I could spend 3 hours talking about reforms and things that prosecutors could be doing differently, but I'll briefly just list the three. I think they should use they should use prosecutorial discretion broadly. And when I say that, I mean, as a prosecutor, if you announce, I'm not charging anybody else with, for instance, possession of small amounts of drugs. No, you can't decriminalize it yourself, of course, that's the legislature's job, but police are generally less inclined to make arrests when they know that the person is not going to be charged and convicted. You can almost never tell police not to arrest somebody who's actually committed a crime, but certainly that has a deterring effect by just saying we're not going to charge X type of crime. Also, I would like to see more use of pre-charge diversion as opposed to charging somebody and then trying to divert them out. If you know from the beginning that a person needs to be diverted out of the system, then don't charge them in the first place. There are other options that one can take to address a crime or something like drug use. Lastly, I think and most importantly, I would like to see more policies that are intentionally anti-racist. So that means that the prosecutors must identify and rectify disparate impact. So why is it that Wayne County in Michigan is 40% Black, but Black people make up more than 70% of all misdemeanors and felony convictions? Some people really honestly believe that this disparity is because Black people are more prone to violence than anybody, like we're Klingons from Star Trek or something. I mean, it's not true now. It never has been true. So given the responsibility that prosecutors have, they should exercise broad discretion when available, use pre-charge diversion, and institute anti-racist policies.
Thank you for that. And I also appreciate the Star Trek reference there. And I am going to pass it to Bishop Starks for the next question.
All right. Just a note, we got 30 minutes, everyone. This is for Mr. Parker. What impact does policing have on public safety? What role should police play in our communities? How is that different from what policing looks like today?
Again, I believe, law enforcement should be educational. I think if it's educational, people will understand the laws and they understand the do's and the don'ts. And what I mean by educational, I used to do career days with school children. And when we used to go to the career days, we used to talk about law enforcement and what our job is when we're policing and the things that we're supposed to do and things that we're not supposed to do. I think that it should be educational, but not as well as educational. I think that the community and law enforcement work together to be inclusive. That I have that teaching aspect of it. And I think for me, that working out in my training unit where I'm enforcement officer at, one reason only is to teach new to do or not to use tactics that have been used for years on end. And I believe in order for us to move forward, it has to start with getting rid of that, as you would say, the good old boys or that old system of thinking within law enforcement. Basically, when police officers go to police academy, they're getting the minimum standard to become a police officer. A lot of times in departments, they don't have training funds or they misuse those training funds. So those officers aren't properly trained on stuff like implicit bias, cultural diversity. They may take those funds and use them in other aspects of, as you guys are speaking about, in other training areas that's really not needed. The funding is really not needed to enhance ticket writing, things of that nature. How does it look? You said, how does it look today if we was to change that policing? I think you would get more trust within the community. You'll get more trust with certain communities if you police. And I'll give you a perfect example. So here's the example I want to give. So a young who's 19 years old, he gets a ticket. Sometimes that's immature. He forgets to pay that ticket, and upon not paying that ticket, they suspend his license. Once they suspend his license, he doesn't realize his license is suspended until he's pulled over by the next officer, and it could be a year, 2 years down the line. He may have moved in between, went to college, and didn't get that ticket in the mail, forgot about that ticket. Now he's driving with a suspended license. He's locked up. He misses school. He misses scholarships that he may have gotten because he missed school. Then the system gives him a cash bail that's way higher than what it should be for him to pay that bail. So he has to stay in jail, thus getting fired from the job because of the cycle where the officer has discretion. Did he have to give him the ticket? Could he educate him? Could he give him an educational piece when pulling him over? Hey, you know, your paper license plate has to be, it has to be displayed a certain way, or your registration tab has to be displayed a certain way. For me, that's community policing. You don't have to give that ticket. And I think a lot of times officers dealing with communities of Black and brown are overzealous to give tickets or make arrests. Where in the other communities, they will get that warning and educate those people and send them on their way. So I think those are some things that has to happen within law enforcement in order for us to change the policing aspect of it.
Can I add something to what Mr. Parker is saying really fast? I think one of the things we have to think about as a community is who becomes police officers. So right now, lots of people of color don't want to become the police because they see the police as the oppressors, and that makes sense to us. However, you have Mr. Parker who's out there, who's a law enforcement officer because he intended to serve his community, and you can tell we've met before. But if we don't do something soon and something relatively quickly, what we're going to have is the only people who want to become police officers are people like Kyle Rittenhouse, who are militia members. And until or unless communities abolish the police, we are going to have police forces that have fewer and fewer people of color as sergeants and lieutenants and deputy chiefs and chiefs. And we are going to have, all white supremacist police forces. And that's something that we really have to be concerned about. And somehow we've got to sort of thread the needle of understanding that the police are often part of the problem. Some police are not part of the problem. And what we need are we need more police officers like Mr. Parker who are in it because they want to serve their own communities. And that's a struggle. It's a struggle now. And it's going to be a bigger struggle really soon.
All right.
And I just want, go ahead.
No. I just want to say, because I got to toss it back to Dr. Duckworth. But go ahead and take a quick stab at it, attorney, about 60 seconds.
I can go.
Yeah, it's about 60 seconds, right quick.
You were like breaking out. I'm sorry.
Okay, so I
heard somebody else talking. Go ahead.
So.
I think we got a tech issue.
Kate, I kind of dropped off for a minute. Are we on the next question? Which question are we on?
Well, hold on. Let me toss it to Dr. Duckworth, and then put the next question on the floor.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. The next question definitely is in the field of Pastor Overman. What role do non-governmental community organizations, religious groups, block clubs, cultural organizations, and others have in shaping what public safety looks like? And how can individuals and organizers like us all play a role in keeping our communities safe?
So that question really, it's kind of what we try to do with several different organizations I'm working with, and I can't wait to hear the other panelists' thoughts on this as well. But I'm really from the mindset that we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater on this one. We have to get rid of a system that was built and designed, and not only is the foundation and the mortar that holds it together systemic, racist, hateful, and designed to keep a certain group empowered, but every single brick that it's layered with is the same way. So when I look at a system like that, I know the entire thing has to go. But I also know enough about the way things are that we will not be able to do that. Just take it, knock it all over and start over. So what do we do in the meanwhile as residents, as community members in our city councils, on our school boards, on our neighborhood watches, in our churches, as we deal with social justice, as we deal with the Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, and everything in between? What do we do when we define what public safety should look like? And how can we reimagine this? And I alluded earlier to blight and to organizations and nonprofits and those with money that can simply come in and help us restructure and make things better as far as safety. Like, we all realize that if a place is lit up, less crime takes place, right? So DTE, how do you help us with this? We also realize that when residents and neighbors take ownership, slumlords are held accountable. We realize when we change our mindset about our neighbors that live in public housing, that things get better there. So how do we incorporate the things that we know for sure to make change in what public safety looks like? And I'm a firm believer that there is no voice too small and no voice too loud. I do realize, because I'm old enough to know, right, that if you don't speak loud, there will be someone speaking loud on your behalf with their agenda. So we have to be courageous in our example. We have to be bold in our thoughts and not afraid to say that we got to throw the baby out with the bathwater, no matter who don't like it, because what has happened has been built and strengthened for someone else and not our best interest. When we look at, I am very personal with this. My sister called for help for my nephew in Maryville, Indiana. He was murdered by the police. You can't tell me that in a community that small, the dispatcher couldn't have told the officer that there is a mental health care alert for this young man when they asked him to get out of the car. They certainly could have left him sitting in that car until they called a Trish Duckworth, where they call someone that's able to negotiate, just like they do so often when it's someone of a different ethnicity, right? They get them help. We've watched them walk them out. No matter what they do, they get to live and come out. You can be in the middle of a crisis with a water gun and you're murdered by the police if you look like me. So these things have got to change, and they will not change without legislation. They will not change in your community if you're not at your city council meetings, if you're not a part of these board meetings, if you're not saying, I will not have officers running my kids over, racing down the street, chasing someone that they saw with a tail light out. We've got to be the voice of our communities, of the organizations in our communities. And just like you, Pastor Duckworth, I believe that Jesus was the first person, other than the Old Testament, that reinforced social justice. You simply have got to have a voice that speaks for the weak, the marginalized, the ones that we've said, and I think the young man who said poverty doesn't make you violent. We've got to have that voice. And this is how I feel. We got to be engaged at that next level, which is every room I'm in, I'm having this conversation about what things should look like. And I'm so thankful that we're hearing normal was not normal before. We don't want what we had before. We're looking to reimagine a lot of things, and public safety is simply one of the first things that we have to reimagine. So hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Pastor Overman. Now I'm going to pass along to Attorney Mason.
Attorney Mason, so fancy today. Thank you, Pastor Overman. That was, I have so many there. I wish we had even longer for this discussion. There's so many things that I want to ask you guys about on the panel. But one thing that I did want to ask, I had sort of a specific question about police unions, but I think I want to ask a broader question to the panel more, a little bit more generally about accountability for police officers, for law enforcement officers who do things that are violent or racist or both. So we know that there are, it's been difficult to hold police accountable, even in really high profile cases. And that's not even getting at, all of the things that don't make the news. So I want to ask you guys, things like police unions, qualified immunity that shields police officers from being held accountable in court for a lot of their actions, internal police department processes. What do you guys think about how those things should be reformed, what police accountability should look like? And Dr. Jackson, you might be the best person to start us off, since I know this is your wheelhouse.
Well, I'm happy to try. I just posted a link in the chat too about how police unions often fight reform. And I have been chastised and disciplined, well, not disciplined maybe, but attempted to be disciplined by our police union in Ann Arbor because they hate that I share this article. So I'm going to share it here anyway. I think police accountability is tough. They haven't had to be accountable. They have qualified immunity and they know it. And so they know that they can do what many police officers understand, that they can do what they want to do with impunity, that they will be protected. And so I think there are some suggestions about having police officers have to have personal insurance, taking away qualified immunity, things like that. I think those are long range goals and they can happen. None of these things happen though without people rising up. On a local level, you can insist that your city council and people who get elected and want to remain elected, that they hold the police department accountable. Oversight commissions do that to some degree, and it's certainly something that we work on, but we can only do that as much as the public backs us. So when I go to city council and say, you guys know that the police department responded to a 911 call and of a home invasion and broke down the wrong door. So not only was the person with the home invasion did not have police response, some other people who were minding their own business had their door broken down and people and police officers come in with guns. That the police have to be accountable for that. It's not just that they have to say they're sorry, which to my knowledge has not yet happened, but they have to take steps and share those steps about how they're going to prevent things in the future. So it's not so oversight, we see oversight as being proactive. And one of the things we think about in terms of accountability is transparency. If you don't know what your police department is doing, we can't even hold them accountable. We can't account because we don't know everything that they're doing. And many police departments would prefer to be much less transparent than what we would like them to be. I think that is a fair statement to say. In Detroit, your board of police commissioners is different from ours. Half the people are appointed, but half the people are elected. And those people serve the community. And so the community has the ability to say, look, this is what we want from our police department, and this is what we want you to advocate for from our police department. And I think transparency is the beginning of that, and accountability is the other piece of that. But people need to be disciplined such that they do not do those behaviors, exhibit those behaviors again in the future. And without that, which we see very little of, there is no reason for police to stop doing what they're doing, because they know there aren't going to be any negative consequences. They're not going to be personally sued. They are very, very, very unlikely to be even charged, and they are even less likely to be convicted. And so, but those things are things that we can change as we stand united and kind of rise up against these things and insist that we are not going to tolerate those things anymore. And I think that's the only way those things change in the short term.
Thank you. We are getting a little short on time, so I want to pass it back to Dr. Duckworth. I don't know if you want to go straight into the Q&A or if you want to close us out with our final question for the panel. And after that, we can wrap up with some questions from everybody.
Well, you know,
just one quick, Dr.
go ahead.
Duckworth, let me interject just 1 second. Make sure everybody that is here, if you would, we posted in the chat an evaluation form. If you would be so kind and click it and evaluate what you heard here, that'd be wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Duckworth. Go ahead.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, I think what I want to do is, because we have our guest that came, and I wanted to eliminate my question and allow a little bit more time for Q&A from our guests. So I would like to open it up now for our guests to ask questions.
I saw Jill had a question earlier, and everybody else, if you want to drop questions in the chat. Jill had asked about the school to prison pipeline and how that impacts public safety, and what conversations, if any, police should be having with schools around that topic.
Do you just want anyone to take the questions?
Yep, totally open. Whoever wants to jump in.
Well, the one thing that we know is that when you think about education and the preparation, if you teach the child to read prior to the 3rd grade, they'll learn to read, right? And you really impact that, and the data shows that. right? You impact and change that trajectory for the prison pipeline. So we need to make sure or ensure that funding is in schools that have the most need in those marginalized communities, that have resources readily available, because there really is a way to plug that. You can stop that immediately by making sure that kids and families have what they need to ensure a fair and equitable education. Lots of data for that.
Well, from a defense standpoint, I'm a little leery when I think of the idea of police kind of roaming around schools. But if there is any positive impact of that, I think the idea that school children or people who are in school are familiar with the people who are policing their communities, I think that can only be a good thing, even if it's a situation where an officer does something that the community does not support. I mean, the people will be able to say, "Hey, look, this person, we know this guy or this woman. They act either consistent with that on a regular basis, or they don't act like that, and this is something that is totally not consistent with how they treated us." Just more interaction with police officers, generally speaking, I think is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just about what kind of interactions is occurring, I think.
Thank you. And yeah, if anybody else has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. There was one question I saw earlier that I believe from Nancy Bass that asked about the pay disparity between prosecutors and public defenders. And I know that that's different for every jurisdiction, but if any of you guys want to speak a little bit about the maybe resources generally in terms of how resources are distributed between prosecutors' offices, you know, how much is devoted to policing and then how much is devoted to public defense and other kinds of services, and what impact that has on public safety.
Sure, I guess I'll go with this one first because this is, obviously my area. Well, it's only been recent. Well, let me start with policing. I mean, I think it's kind of a unquestioned, a given that policing is much more well funded when you compare it to the rates of funding for prosecutors' offices and defense offices. I mean, you have the exception to every rule. I think Livingston County is like one of the most well-funded jurisdictions in the state, and they fund their prosecutors' offices very well. So you have exceptions to the rules, but I think generally you get more funding for police officers. If for no other reason, policing is more expensive to fund and to run on a day-to-day basis. As far as any disparities between funding of criminal defense and prosecutors, that's a very recent thing. I mean, defense attorneys have fought for decades to get adequate funding to represent indigent and people who need help. And so governors around the country are kind of realizing the value and having a more robust defense department. So over the past few years, you've seen more funding going into defense firms' coffers, or I shouldn't say firms, let's say public defender units. But that's very much recent, and it's still nowhere near to where it needs to be. As far as funding for prosecutors, I think that while you definitely need to maintain, prosecutors need to make living wages. I mean, you don't want anybody working for below minimum wage or just a wage that they can't even live off of. But because we have there's a trend toward decarceration, I think that's an incentive for prosecutors to reevaluate what's important and what's a priority. Is it a priority to spend, put 3 or 4 prosecutors on cases involving something like, very small amounts of drugs? Is that worth it? So I think that kind of gives incentive for prosecutors to kind of reevaluate that and determine what's a priority and shift according to what people in the community have said. This is a priority for us. This is what we want you to do.
Thank you. And Bishop, you want to take some of these other questions from the chat?
Yeah, sure. We have one, and it was speaking to how can we keep spreading the word about repealing the truth in sentencing and reinstating good time credits as a factor for public safety and well-being? And that's for the floor.
I think that's legislative far as the good time and crediting. I know there's some good time and crediting with county. Usually they give the counties the authority for, or what's called a classification for good time and sentencing. And a lot of times that also can have disparities in it, because a white inmate that comes into the jail who has been on drunk driving 6 or 7 other times, and a black gentleman or the black young lady who has come into the jail on their first drunk driving may not get the same good time as that white gentleman. Again, it goes back to the system and how they're doing everything. It's supposed to be a point system, but nobody understands that point system. So I think, you have to lobby with those departments and sit down with those leaders in those departments on how they're doing stuff.
All right, I got you. Okay, we have a couple more here, if I can get to it.
We have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
Matter of fact, I seen it was Carl Baxter. Are you still there, Carl?
Yeah, his question.
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Yes, I am.
Okay, I was looking for your question. Ask your question, sir.
My question, can we help the community understand the differences? What would be good differences between defunding or reshaping public safety?
I want to jump in here and say both are necessary. Those are different things. If your police department has too much money and can do without it, and that money could be redistributed into prevention programs or things that lift up areas where people come in contact with the police, like mental health services, homelessness services, things like that. That's a piece of defunding police. But reshaping public safety is even bigger than that. And it involves us thinking about things we don't usually think about, like traffic enforcement. Most traffic citations are civil, they're not criminal. And so do you need armed police to pull you over for failing to signal? But we know that millions of Americans come in contact with the police through traffic stops. And Black Americans are 20% more likely to be stopped, and we are twice as likely to be killed because of traffic stops. You guys know that already. And so that's when we think about reshaping or reimagining public safety, we have to think about big things like, how do people come in contact with the police? And are those things where we necessarily need to come in contact with the police? And so developing traffic enforcement that does not include unarmed police could take millions of people away from encounters with the police. Police could still deal with, people fleeing and on, felony, instances like robbing a bank and fleeing in a car, or drunk driving, or, perhaps speeding over a certain amount. So it doesn't preclude them from doing that, but it does take away the possibility that you will get shot and killed, as we know has happened for failing to signal.
Right.
And so that's when we talk about reshaping or reimagining public safety. We got to think big, and we have to think about what are the big problems and how could we change them. And again, they have to fit every community. But activists, people are usually talking to your city council about that. Oversight commissions are usually talking about that. And so, as you see protests and demonstrations happening, usually that's an opportunity where people are sharing more information about how to reshape public safety. And so in Ann Arbor, we do that. Tricia Duckworth is on the line, and Survivor Speak is an agency in a nonprofit in our area that's always talking about public safety and things like that. So reaching out to those groups and finding out what's going on and how you can help, or just how you can get more information is always something that people are willing to share. But the police are rarely going to engage in conversations about defunding themselves or reshaping themselves. And it's something that I think government officials like city councils have to be forced to do, because it's challenging work. It's hard work. You got to work really hard to do it. It's not something people really are enthusiastic about doing unless the public is adamant about that happening.
I think also it's very important that we figure out ways to engage the police in the process, because you're absolutely right. They're not going to think about it, but it's very advantageous for them to work alongside the residents and every citizen for being the best public safety available, right? So I don't know how we can do that, but I think until we do that, we'll still have these conversations and we'll still have listening tours and we'll still do what we do. But they have to buy into that they want something better also, because most of them were adopted into the system. And just when it was trained in this madness, they shot at Black targets. And I'm sure if we said, let's make our targets look different and give them green eyes, I'm almost certain things would change immediately. There are some things we know we can do that would change the game. It's just, do we have the courage to do them? And I think we do, because that's why Michigan United is doing the work that they're doing. But sometimes you need, like, Mother, may I take a giant step? And that's what I think we need to do in this environment. And thank you guys for this opportunity. I think this conversation has been very helpful. And I do see some of the same people that we work with all the time. And we have got to learn to engage the ones that's sitting behind us, that's just watching, and push them up front to speak up and to do more, right?
Okay.
So
All
this is
right.
cool.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. We are at time. We definitely appreciate this wonderful panel that came forth and answered very clearly each of these questions, took time out their busy schedule. So we appreciate you. I'm going to toss it to Kate and Dr. Duckworth.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Could have this discussion with you guys all day. This was so fascinating. So thank you to all the panelists. Thanks to everybody who came. And yeah, Dr. Duckworth, if you want to close us out before we get kicked out of the breakout room.
Okay, there is a link for the afternoon session at 1. There is a separate link for the town hall. Please know that this link won't be good after we come from break. God bless you all. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.